Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us so far. And thank you, immense thank you to Bushra, Dawn, Elijah, L, and Maya for that discussion. It was incredible. I know the chat was blowing up with just people talking about how much they loved it. And just thank you so much. What a day it's been so far. We absolutely could not have done this without you, all of our speakers, and without all of our viewers. And I want to give a huge thank you to all of you who have gone through the whole ride with us. We know a lot of you have been here since hour one, and it has been an honor to be your guide throughout the day. Our final session of the day is Disability Innovation and the Future of Work. Please welcome to the stage Kathy Nestrick, Vice President of Women's Leadership and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at the American Bankers Association, Morenike Giwa Onaiwu, a global activist, scholar, author, and community leader, Kamel Arroyo, Chief Accessibility Officer at the MTA, and Tiffany Yu, CEO of Diversability. Can you say something, Megan? You're on mute, Kathy. Wouldn't be a virtual conference without it.
Sorry, everybody. I said, hey, everybody, how are we ready? Are we ready to go? Ready for this team?
I'm ready.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're really excited to be talking to you about this really important conversation about disability inclusion. And we really thank Ellevate for bringing this important conversation to us. You know, Ellevate really does elevate important conversations. And it's amazing to me that there are 1.3 billion people living with disabilities around the world. And today we have an excellent panel of experts who are really going to bring us some insight and real solutions that we can all take back to move the conversation forward. So let's get to it. So disability drives innovation, and I think that it follows that disability inclusion also drives innovation. So let's think about this from a business perspective. How do businesses stand to gain if they employ more people with disabilities? Is somebody open to taking that?
And I'd be happy to chime in. First, thanks so much for having me. It's truly a pleasure to be sharing this space with you all. I'm Kumar Arroyo Q, and I think businesses are very dormant on the economic value of the disability community. Rarely do people understand that this money power isn't really what Q brings to the table as a person with a disability, or what any individual person with disability may bring. It's really their community. People with disabilities, on average, travel with a posse, with either a caregiver, a significant other, a friend, or a group of people. So much more than non-disabled people who are usually traveling solo, or by and large not as prone to travel with the community. So we're really thinking about a moat of people, a whole environment of individuals that are not driving towards different companies or service providers because they haven't woken up to the fact that their space, their inaccessible space, is keeping customers from coming through that door. They're leaving money behind at the table when they don't have wheelchair accessible hotel rooms, and that entire family doesn't come in vacation at your establishment, or a wedding venue doesn't happen there because we don't want guests with disabilities to not be able to join us, or because they'll be able to dine, but they won't be able to dance. And what fun is a wedding if you can't dance? So we really need to think about the ecosystem that's around this conversation, all the different elements. And, the disability community used to have a tagline, Tiffany, you've heard it so many times, nothing about us without us. Well, now that's shifted to nothing without us, because we just don't want to talk about what you think the disability community wants to talk about, where we want to participate in and go. We're everywhere. And it's not just us, but we're your friends, your family, your bosses, your colleagues. So it's really the entire environment is sleeping at the wheel and not benefiting from this economic power that is the disability community.
Yeah, I love that economic powerhouse here. Tiffany, I'd love to go to you next. And let's talk about, this is also a large segment of the population where unemployment is very high. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are the top factors that are either hindering or enabling people living with disabilities to get jobs and keep jobs?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I also want to add a stat. I thought Q was going to mention it. So there's a report from 2018 from Accenture that talks about, and let me see if I can pull up the headline numbers. It says champions of disability inclusion, these are companies, achieve 28% higher revenue, double the net income, and 30% higher economic profit margins than their peers. So if people are really talking about the business case for disability inclusion, now we have research that's out there that's if your company or your corporation or your brand wants to be more profitable, disability inclusion is the way to go, right? And Kathy, you mentioned disability inclusion drives innovation. So to answer your question about the top factors, I also want to share two other stats. So one is there was some research that was done a couple of years ago in 2019 where they surveyed hiring managers as to the top reasons why they didn't prioritize disability inclusion or why they didn't hire a disabled employee. And the number 1, 2, and 3 answers were that they weren't sure what a disabled person could or couldn't do. So with this data, what we are learning is that a lot of people are assuming what disabled people can or can't do, right? So even at the point of entry, you're saying, oh, so in my particular case, I have one of my arms is paralyzed. People might assume, oh, Tiffany can't type, so we're not going to have her at this office job. Little do people know that I was top of my class at Goldman Sachs Investment Banking, typing those pitch books with one hand and creating those Excel models. So I'm really grateful, again, that I had these employers who gave me a chance because they didn't make assumptions about what I could or couldn't do. I also want to share one other stat, and I have to pull it up because I want to make sure I get it right, which is that there was a study that was done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2020. And they asked disabled people, why do you think you didn't get that job? And I want to share that 79% said their own disability. And I wanted to highlight that because one of the things that I often talk about is that our disability is not the problem, ableism is. Our disability is not the problem, the lack of accessibility is, right? The lack of understanding of, again, what we can or can't do. So the way that that filters out from our society telling us, oh, you can't do all of these things, we as disabled people start to internalize that. And then we think, oh, I didn't get that job because my disability makes it so that I can't have that job. And so I wanted to kind of close. I know I shared some stats, but I wanted to close. I had an opportunity to give a TED Talk recently, and I was asked to provide 3 top-level tips to provide employers to help disabled employees thrive. So number 1, I've talked about a lot, is to not make assumptions. Give disabled people the opportunity to show you how we do our job so that we're not special anymore and we can actually co-create those work environments with you. The second is really rethinking accessibility. So a lot of people think accommodations are expensive or out of reach or, again, cost prohibitive or high tech. But the truth of the matter is that the majority of accommodations cost $0 free to implement. So for example, for someone like me, I could benefit from speech to text technology. And now with Zoom and Google Meet and all these other things, there are captions, as I'm talking that will show up and I can download that transcript, or I can go straight to a tool like Otter, OTTER, or Descript, to be able to get those transcripts if someone is asking me to write a lot of text. And then the final thing I'll say is around embracing flexibility. So disabled people, we've had to learn how to adapt in environments that weren't built for us. And it took a pandemic for a lot of people to realize that a virtual conference like this could happen, or a remote work environment could happen. And I think that the same way that we had the pandemic lens on the way we thought about rethinking how our employees could work, if we have that level of flexibility with how we approach employing and engaging our disabled employees, I think that will be a good start.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the pandemic has really taught us so much along those lines, Tiffany. And that was a great segue to go to you, Morinike, about ableism. Tiffany mentioned it. Talk to us about ableism. What is it? Sometimes we may be acting in an ableist way. What is it? What are ways to disrupt it in ourselves and others that we influence?
Thank you so much, Kathy. So it's interesting because, like all the other isms, everyone bristles, if they think that this, could apply to them, when in actuality, it probably would be a better question to ask, what isn't ableism? Because we are all raised in an ableist society. It is interwoven. It is like the air that we breathe that's surrounding us, in the atmosphere. That being that not having a disability, being perceived as or having a disability, being abled, is preferable, is the status quo, is the preferred and optimal way to be. And if you ask every human being, just like if you ask anyone, are you homophobic? Are you racist? Are you ableist? Everyone's answer is going to say no. Because they're thinking of the person in the KKK hood, or they're thinking of the person who, doesn't allow, women to, drive or to whatever. And they're not thinking about all the insidious little ways that these things are perpetuated throughout our society, in the terminology that we use, in the way that we describe things, in the way that we might try to overcompensate, or the assumptions that we make. Tiffany was mentioning, the fact that it's a proven fact that the majority of accommodations cost little to nothing. The few that cost money, I think the median cost is approximately $500. Many of them are implemented for free and are not anything that is harmful to the employer. In fact, can boost productivity with other employees, whether they have a disability or not. And yet this curb cut effect is not anything that is really lauded. And I think that what we need to do, all of us need to do, is like we have started to learn to do with other things in our lives. The other panelists were talking a great deal about, a lot of matters related to anti-Blackness and racism and so forth. And I think with ableism, I think that what people need to do is kind of stop, think, and filter, before they do things, because I believe that it isn't that people necessarily wish to be inherently ableist, but how can one not be in a society that was built in such a way? And so rather than, being defensive, one should look at what are the ways that you can increase and open, accessibility and make things more inclusive for others. Like look at ways to grow and to bring more people to the table. And elongate the table, and bring another way for people to eat if the table's not ideal. And I think that that's, a problem. We have to disrupt and change it by recognizing that it exists. I think the denial is problematic. And I think that, people veer to one of two, extremes, either, the, inspiration porn aspect of things or the aspect of things where it is where you care so much that you aren't allowing, you don't presume competence, aren't allowing people with disabilities to lead, to share, to grow, to do what we can do, and I think we've seen a lot of that again in this pandemic. So we have to disrupt it by, we have to see it and recognize it and acknowledge it first and stop being afraid of it. And then it needs to be something that we call out like we do with anything else. It's kind of like the last frontier where it's still allowed for people to say and do things that are inappropriate, things that they wouldn't say about race or gender or other things are still permitted and even celebrated with regard to how we, the terminology that we use with disability.
Yeah, such great advice. I really like the stop, think, and filter before we speak and before we act. Be intentional about our language and about what we're doing. Great advice there. Kamel, I'd love to come back to you. I'm wondering, can you set the stage for us about how people living with disabilities impact our communities and impact the economy?
It's really a great question. Tiffany spoke earlier about the challenges that people with disabilities face and what they bring to the table. I like to synthesize that and say that people with disabilities are really the first and natural hackers. We're hackers because we are constantly iterating uh, um, breaking devices and fixing them to meet our needs, because like she said, nothing is designed for a person with a disability, or what I like to call a non-conforming body. And you know, I have a gripe with Da Vinci and the Vitruvius Man, because to this day, everything that we build, from vehicles and the dummies that are used to test crash in cars, to you name it, is designed for a 6 foot tall, white, able bodied male. And that's just not me. That's not most of the world. And when I look at the Vitruvius Man, I think, well, where do I belong in that diagram? You know, where is a short statured person or a seated body like mine in a wheelchair fit that mold? And the reality is that people with disabilities contribute so much to our environment. Not only the fact that the disability community is to this day the second largest overeducated, underemployed demographics in America. So there is a wealth of knowledge that isn't being leveraged and isn't at the table because of those perceived needs, or people's own internal ableism that we members of the disability community have internalized and accepted and started to believe. But also, as a person with a disability, I I love to say that I understand that accessibility is universal. And in my role, what I bring to the table as a person with a disability and the first ever chief accessibility officer at the MTA is that, you know, I'm not the first ever chief disabled officer here. Accessibility for me is quite broad and includes parents and caregivers with children in strollers, or adults in strollers and wheelchairs, our aging community, very few of whom would ever allow me to call them a person with a disability, but all of whom benefit from what I bring to the New York street and our transportation system here. And then, of course, our tourists, all of whom need assistance, and none of whom could get through a turnstile here in New York with luggage coming from JFK or LaGuardia. So accessibility addresses the needs of all those individuals. Here in New York, you know, something that I've delivered as of late has been a stroller space on buses, where we extracted a roll of seats and provided an open stroller space for parents and caregivers with strollers, not at the expense of the disability community, but in addition to those spaces that the disability community fought for so long. And now we have in all of our buses. So we're really reimagining where else did we miss the mark? What else have we not been providing? And that's happening because we are leading with accessibility in mind, understanding that accessibility is universal. And so many people have stresses and difficulties navigating our transportation system, for whom an accessible solution is what's needed. So that's what I'm bringing to the table, really expanding the definition of accessibility, going beyond the disability, and in there, and in, you know, with that, bringing so many other voices that all benefit from the solutions that we're building, kind of like the curb cut solution that we all know of. You know, curb cuts were not designed for the delivery man or woman, for the parents with a stroller. Yet all these individuals benefit from a curb cut.
Yeah, great, really great point. And I want to go back to something you said earlier. You were talking about hacking solutions. And when you think about what employers are looking for in employees, we need problem solvers. And for people living with disabilities who are navigating a world not built for them, they are problem solvers. So that's a little bit of a segue to, I'd like to talk about a neurodivergent workforce. Is there any advice that any of you have for companies looking to be more inclusive for a neurodivergent workforce? Tiffany, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can go ahead and answer that. So, you know, to me, neurodivergence, I put neurodivergence and disability together because maybe it's like the curb cut of workforce inclusion. But I have noticed there's a lot of interest in neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And I'm going to share a couple stats. So one stat I'm going to share, and this is to Q's point, is around 75% of your disabled employees have an idea that would add value to their company's bottom line. So we are going out there, we're hacking, and we're also designing things that can, again, make your company more money. So that was kind of just an asterisk on Q's thing. But I wanted to address this because there's also another stat out there that says that about 76 to 80% of disabled employees don't feel comfortable being transparent about their disabilities at work. That's from an Accenture report in 2020. So 4 out of 5 of your disabled employees don't feel comfortable being transparent about their disabilities. So I wanted to share that because about 62 to 70% of disabilities are not apparent, which means, Q's a wheelchair user, I have a paralyzed arm, and so we're actually not the majority of what disabled people look like. So when I say 62 to 70%, if you're going down the sidewalk and you see someone, chances are they may have it. If they're disabled, you might not be able to tell. And so oftentimes I want to come out and I want to tell people that disability has no look. And I think for a long time, we have focused on mobility disabilities as a type of accessibility or accommodation that we need to develop solutions for. So when we come to neurodivergence, we're talking about people who might learn differently or think differently, and again, who also work differently. And so I want to share 2 examples these are real life examples from some of my peers who work at large tech companies. And so both of them have either included an auto response on their email or in their email signature that says, "Hi, I have ADHD and it comes with communication differences. I work best if you schedule a call, or if you haven't heard from me in a couple of days, please bump this email," or put urgent in the subject line. Then I have another example of someone who is dyslexic, and they say, "Hey, I have dyslexia, and it comes with, again, email challenges. And so the best way to get in touch with me if you're an internal is Slack. And the best way to get in touch with me if you're external is to follow up with a list of, follow-up items." I wanted to share both of those examples. I don't know if that's exactly advice, but I wanted to share some of the more progressive things that are happening when these companies have created a level of psychological safety that I can assert the things I need in order to communicate with you best. And I see Q unmuted himself, so maybe I'll turn it over to him if he has other advice.
Thanks, Stephanie. I really wanted to build on that and say something that you already mentioned earlier, and that is that most people engage disabilities as something obtuse. And I know, because before I acquired my disability, I used to be one of those people. The only concept that I had of disability were my mom's patient, and my mom was a home attendant, and they were sedentary, they were homebound, and not very active members of their environment any longer. Persons with disabilities are really just looking for someone to engage. That's it. And when you talk about IDDs and the needs of the IDD community, in so many cases here, when we talk about it in transportation, the solutions have been so simple, often free to implement. And all it engaged was a dialogue between folks understanding that their needs is just for you to not use jargon, or to really be more colloquial and stop using transportation terms when you're communicating to your customers who don't understand these transportation jargons. And I tell my team every day, we are nothing more than a bunch of overeducated people who think we have solutions to problems. And we will most often fail unless we come up with ideas and policies and changes with end users who will validate the thoughts will help us not miss the mark. And all it takes, the difference between success and failure, is engaging.
Yeah, great advice from both of you. Tiffany, loved your very specific examples. I think they'll help people in the audience who are looking for some specific tactical ways to address these issues. Maureen and Kay, I'd love to go back to you and talk about COVID. We've got some things to thank COVID for, and that is a new flexibility. We've got people who are working from home. And in some respects, this is helping people living with disabilities. There are some potential downsides. We hear a lot about bias against people who are not working physically in the workspace. If you're not around, out of sight, out of mind, you may not be in mind for that next promotion, that next stretch project, et cetera. So my question to you is, let's talk about strategies, which may be technologies that can help support people living with disabilities who are working in these remote workspaces.
Sure, I'm going to address that, and I'm also going to try to incorporate a few thoughts about the neurodivergent workforce as someone who myself is, autistic as well as a person with ADHD. So I think that there's a lot of relevance to this question. So I have a great deal of ambivalence. As you mentioned, there's positives and negatives to this. Like, I think that what we saw, a lot of the flexibility that we saw when COVID happened was great. But what wasn't great is how many of us had been asking for that for years and years and years, and it couldn't be done. It was impossible. It was too complicated. It was too expensive when we needed it, disabled people. And then when it was something that everybody else needed, all of a sudden the people found a way to make it happen. And so I guess my first thing that I would think, like some of the strategies that I would think, is that now that we've seen that it's possible, which it was always possible, it needs to continue to be a possibility. It shouldn't be a consolation prize for, a situation or a time limited, matter. It should be something that we see that is an effective and should be an equivalent way, for people to contribute to work, to communicate and so forth. It shouldn't be, so the hybrid options shouldn't, disappear. The options to, do things in other ways shouldn't change. I think we also need strategies that we don't need to make these things a chore or a hassle to access. It shouldn't be a convoluted process to be able to obtain them or request them. There shouldn't be an unspoken rule to where, yes, you can flex Fridays, but the people who come in physically are really seen as harder workers or more valuable employees or what have you. And in that sense, we need to have mechanisms for measuring progress more holistically. There are ways to determine the value of one's time and contributions that are different than that you would measure in face-to-face. And I think that making these options such that they are universal for whether a person has a disability or not. We talked earlier about the captioning. The captioning can be great for someone who is hard of hearing, or someone who is more of a visual, like multimodal learning, or someone who maybe English is not their first language, and being able to read things helps them to connect and change it. It could be, or for a variety of reasons, it can be a helpful option. So I think the ups and downs. I think that we need to make sure that people understand that, working remotely isn't some type of stepchild way of working. In some ways it can be, more ideal, and you can have save a lot more time and get a lot more done. So I think that we need to invest in these technologies. A lot of them are free or low cost. I think we need to be flexible. We need to be understanding, about things, and we need to, encourage people to use them, whether they have a disability or not, and not leave it as like a worst case scenario matter. And with regard to the neurodivergent workplace, I did like the examples Tiffany recommended, but I also want to question a society where we have to do that. Like, where, okay, if I don't say I didn't email you back right away or didn't whatever, it's going to be seen negatively. So I have to out myself to random strangers in my out of office message, and share, my diagnosis, which may or may not be something they're comfortable doing, because if you don't do this or don't do that or don't do this way, it's seen as negative. And so I would really love if we could all, like, adopting a mentality where we, assume good intent, so if someone's communication is different or needs or is chatting or has their camera off or whatever, instead of assuming negativity, or they're distracted or they're playing on their phone or whatever, or instead maybe we could just, be glad contributing. And so, and make it as such to where they're, if we want something responded in a particular time frame, we specify as such, so the person doesn't have to guess, and everything doesn't have to be so vague and unclear.
Yeah, great perspective there. And as you were talking, it caused me to begin thinking about, there's just a lot here. There are a lot of different kinds of disabilities. We're all individuals regardless of whether we're living with a disability or not. And I think self-education is probably key, because we can control ourselves, right? So let's start with ourselves. Let's educate ourselves. And I'm wondering, can we kind of go around the screen and each of you give a couple of either books or sites or articles that would be helpful for our audience who want to engage and want to learn more? Kamel, could we start with you on that?
Yeah, there's a litany of self-help and great employment development books out there. In my office, I have a copy of Joe Shapiro's No Pity as one of my guiding North Stars pieces of literature, just to remind me of how to present myself and what to bring forward. And Tiffany, you spoke a little bit about this earlier about, how can we just be employees and get to the work and get, beyond this awkward, obtuse conversation. Let's just have a very blatant conversation about what my needs are. You'll be super shocked to hear about how simple they are, and see me and really measure me by my input and the values that I'm contributing. And that book really helped me understand, how to fight beyond the fight, how to move beyond this awkwardness and these conversations, and how to just get stuff done, and letting that be the narrative that drives the conversations with employees, environment, and really, to me, to put it in one sentence, it's just how I show up and how I move around, with the understanding that I may have a different way to get there. I may have an adaptive road, but at the end of the day, I will deliver. I will show up.
I can share 3 resources or 3 tips, because the best things come in 3. So the first is, I think a friend of Q and I's, Emily Ladau, wrote a book called Demystifying Disability. It's a short read, a quick primer. I think the subtitle of it is What to Say. I don't know. I'm not going to get it right. I'll put it into the comments. So number 1, demystifying disability, just a good primer about disability. Number 2, Google it. I want to just put it on a shirt. Google it. If you have a question, Google it. And this month is LGBTQIA plus Pride Month. And I've been reflecting a lot about I've seen a lot of social media content about how we ask intrusive questions to our queer peers about their sex lives. And as disabled people, we get questions like that too. And when people ask intrusive questions like that, it not only objectifies us, but it also, it just like objectifies us. And so that's why number 2 is kind of like Google it. And oftentimes we always encourage asking questions, but I often encourage people to think about, am I asking this question because I'm going to try to co-create an experience together or create more connection? Or am I asking this question because I'm just curious and it's a little bit intrusive and I might not ask the same question to someone else? The third thing I would mention is last year, LinkedIn came out with their first ever LinkedIn Top Voices in Disability Advocacy. I don't want to say this as self-serving because I was on the list, but if people are looking for a place of just people to follow, disabled voices to follow, and I have a chance that this audience is very active on LinkedIn, the people who were named on that list is a great way to start. And I wanted to highlight that as a way to diversify your feed, because a lot of people will say diversify your feed and then they won't tell you who to go follow. And then you're like, okay, well, what hashtags do I look up? That's a great place to start. And I want to mention why that's important. So there's a large discrepancy in terms of what disabled people's lives are like and what are actually portrayed in the media. And oftentimes our lives are portrayed as very overly inspiring or super tragic. And there's no really in between. And as I was doing my own research as to the emergence of the social media generation and seeing disabled creators or disabled voices start to own their own narratives and share their own experiences, what we found is that we were sharing our own stories in our own way, and they were empowering. They weren't rooted in pity. I think to Q's point in his book recommendation, we weren't portrayed as superheroes, and our lives also weren't portrayed as tragic. We were just human beings who were sharing different experiences that we had. And so that's why I just think it's so important. I know that was a very long-winded way to say, go follow these people on LinkedIn, but I wanted to share that context that the media loves an inspiring or a tragic narrative around disability. And the reality is that's not how our lives are. And so all of us are starting to show up on social media to say, hey, here's my life. Actually, if this resonates with you, continue to follow me. But I also hope that you follow a lot of other people so that your experience of what a disability lived experience looks like is shaped by all of this whole entire choir of voices.
I really love everything. Oh, I'm so sorry, Kathy. Were you? Okay. I love everything that you both have shared. And so I'm just going to, and everything they just said. But B, I would want to say that I guess a couple of resources that I would give was one is I would recommend the Ask Jan network. So Ask Jan is the Job Accessibility Network. And it's a website where whether you're an employer, a job seeker, an ally, you can get a lot of information. And I just wanted to mention that because I know that we're talking a lot about, employment in the workplace. And I think that people need to understand and know what their rights are and also how to help ensure that they are making things accessible for others to, for all of us to grow. Another concept that I'd like to share is that finding out more about the concept of disability justice. I think people talk a lot about, there's a lot of terms that are thrown around and they have different meanings to different people. And so I think that, wanting emancipation, celebration, liberation is important, and we have to get there. And so I think that there's a disability rights mentality, which is absolutely, an important one. But I think that because there's so many other elements of our lives and who we are and identities that we have, disability justice is more holistic in that it encompasses more of its principles, help for us to really address all aspects of who we are. Kind of like Tiffany, there was a question about this inspiration point, and kind of Tiffany basically described it, that either, disabled people are, we're either like these tragic figures where you're like, oh, poor thing, sniff, sniff, cry, or we're super crips, you know what I mean? And like, there's no in between, and that's not, real life and reality. And the last thing I would like to share is just to kind of get in more information about like things like universal design and plain language, because those are other ways that you can, be accessible in a multitude of ways, even outside of disability. And so I think there's a lot of resources that people can find that can help, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, speaking of throwing terms around, Maureen K., you mentioned inspiration porn earlier. Can you expand on what you meant by that?
Yes, and Tiffany, I kind of already described it, but essentially, so when disabled people, we're not seen as like the starring characters in our own lives. We're props. We're a message to be learned, or someone to look at and say, oh, wow, I can do it too. Or if they can do it, I can do it. Or thank God I'm not like that, or whatever. Or they're like, so we have to either be perfect at everything, absolutely perfect, flawless, gorgeous, smart, no mistakes, on top of everything. Or we're like this huge drain on society and we're almost subhuman. We're, treated in a pathologizing manner as if we're a child, or worse. And I think that the reality of all people, whether they have a disability or not, is that there's some things you're great at and there's some things that you suck at. And there's some days you're doing well and there's some days you're not doing well. And I think that, everything should not be about, one's disability. Disability, yes, it's an important part of who one is. It isn't something to hide, but as Tiffany mentioned, a lot of disabilities are not easily readily apparent or seen. But even if they are, making a post on social media, oh, my son, has autism or is autistic and he has no friends. His name is this, that, and the other. This is where we live. Please send cards. Would you do that for your non-autistic child who just doesn't maybe have friends because they're introverted or shy? Like, do we have, does everything about, so that's, people think, oh, that's so sweet. Or we voted this person in as homecoming queen so they could have a chance to see what it was like, even though we didn't really want them to be the homecoming queen. Like those are, there's a big difference between accommodation and accessibility and inclusion and just things that are feel good props. And so, so that's what I mean by inspiration porn. Anything where the disabled person is there, kind of like the character of the magical Negro that you sometimes see in literature and cinema. So that because they don't want to make the person a stereotype, they make them this practically all-encompassing, everything, everybody knows everything, wonderful, person. We want to just be regular humans, regular three-dimensional humans, who fight with our spouses and who maybe drink coffee and, stay up late and watch movies, and we happen to have a disability.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all people and we're people first, and let's focus on our commonality. We're all different, but that's not something that we necessarily need to be focusing on. I'm wondering, as we think about how we talk to our children about disabilities, are there ways that we can change this narrative and the way people talk about people living with disabilities? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I can think of so many, but as someone who acquired a disability and was kind of thrown into these waters at 18 and said, run with it, figure it out. I was very fortunate that I went to outward bound schools, and in a very outward bound fashion, we learned to find comfort in distress. And for me, that's the only way that I know that I'm growing or doing something worthy. But also, Kurt Hahn had a quote in which he used to say, "Make your disability your opportunity." And Tiffany is a great example of that. Someone who's really leaned into whatever made them different and made that their competitive advantage, and really use your disability to empower yourself. And the second thing, next month is just we celebrate 33 years of the ADA, and we need to wear that. We need to wear it with pride, and we need to celebrate our diversity. I am so fortunate to live in New York City, in a town where we embrace diversity, where we know that that is our biggest richness that we have and our strongest asset. Well, we need to celebrate the asset that it is to have a myriad of people with disabilities teaching us, educating us, and learning with us, and learning how to fail and normalizing failure. And we're all going to fail, and failure should be celebrated, because the only thing that's wrong with failing is not getting up and trying again.
I'm going to share three things, because the best things come in threes, as I have said many times. The first is I actually want to respond to something that Kathy said about connecting with each other on commonalities. I also think it's okay if someone has a different experience. I think the number of time that someone finds out my arm is paralyzed and then they tell me that they broke their wrist once. In that example, they're trying to find that commonality. And it's also okay if you can't relate. It's okay if my experience is different, right? And this might be more advanced than the parents talking to their kids about disability, to make space for the nuance that, I think for many of us on this panel, we've faced discrimination based on our race. And from me looking, I don't see anyone else who's East Asian, and we've been experiencing a lot of racism in a different way. And that's okay if you can't empathize with that. And can you also make space for that pain? So I wanted to kind of put an asterisk in. Yes, we love the commonalities. That's how we build familiarity and connection and trust with each other. And figuring out those nuances of respecting and making space for where we're different, and the times when we can't empathize because we don't have that lived experience, and that's okay. So that was number one. Number two, I wanted to share an example. I think I read about it on a blog post, where most of the time when there's a kid who sees maybe someone who's in a wheelchair or someone who looks different, the kid will point and say, "Look." And in this example, the parent goes, "Shh, don't do that."
Yes, which is horrible. Sorry.
Correct. And in that case, what is reinforced to the child is that they shouldn't point out anyone's difference.
Mm-hmm.
How that situation could have been different is for the parent to say, yes, that person looks different. Would you want to go and talk to them about that, right? And in that case, creating an invitation to have a conversation rather than that, shh, don't do that. And, I'm not a parent, and my hope is, again, it's been so ingrained in our culture that disability is shameful. And if we learn anything in this conversation, it's that it's not. It's a part of the human experience. And for children, whose curiosity they're kind of in those prime years of just learning about the world and how it is. In that case, I don't know, again, context matters. So if it's a kid, questions are okay. And if the person doesn't feel comfortable answering the question, like figuring out how to respect that boundary and navigate that. And then I forgot my third point. So I'll pass it back.
I'll go ahead and jump in because I am a parent, and so my children all have disabilities as well as my spouse and I. And so first, I want to say I was when Tiffany said that, I was like, yes. I've always been so frustrated because it's the same thing with race. Mommy, why is that person brown? Shh. So they think they're being polite. They mean well, the person, but you're shushing the child. You're teaching the child this is something shameful. I shouldn't say anything about this, or I shouldn't mention this. I should pretend I don't see this. And you're trying to be respectful, but you aren't being, because we are who we are. And so by saying, yes, they are, and some people are brown, or yes, that some people do wear a wheelchair or whatever, use a wheelchair, and that's how they move around or what have you. I think that for me, I'm very candid with my children, and I tell them, like with a lot of things in life, they have their elements of good, they have their elements of bad, and then they have their in the middle, like anything else we talk about, like you have neutrons, protons, and electrons, positive charge, neutral charge, negative charge. And in terms of being disabled, there are things about my disability that my multiple disabilities, I should say, that I lean into, that are helpful, that have made me more creative, and made me have better critical thinking, and made me, have a lot of resilience. And then there's other things that are challenging that I, that take more time and make things more complex. And then there's things that are just kind of, what they are. And so we don't use negative language in our home. Like, for example, when I talk to my children about their disability, I talk to them about what it is, and not just about that you can't do this. Like I'd say never talk to a child the way that anything that you probably read in the ICD or DSM is written, strategic failure at blah, 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 repetitive and restrictive, abnormal, blah, blah, blah. Like, don't use, even in a child-friendly version, don't use that. Who wants to be told that they're low functioning, that they're, this or that they're that, who wants to be called wheelchair bound? No, they're a wheelchair user. They're not bound. That is allowing them to move and be free. So I think that we need to talk to children the way we do about, like Tiffany mentioned, these other things, these other elements of life, that these other, concepts that are very important that we have to address in life to learn life, death, inequities and different things like that. The beauty and the ugly of real world, and the disability should be the same way. And we shouldn't always do it from the lens of the abled. Like there's this interesting, cute little book. It's a satire. It's called, I think, Why Doesn't Cody, I'll have to find it, Flap? And it's written from the perspective of a child who is autistic, who has a friend who is neurotypical. And so he is kind of thinking, wow, such and such comes over and he makes eye contact, and it's really unnerving sometimes, and he doesn't look away, but he's my friend and I like him, so I'm okay with it. So it's kind of like, so he's showing that, it's a two-way street in terms of there's perception on both sides. And so, yeah, I think we just need to be real with children. We need to be age appropriate, but we need to be real. I think we need to understand that children know a lot more than we give them credit for. And if we can give them examples, and show them things, if there's things in their world, are you watching movies? Are you reading books? Where are people with disabilities in their lives? Even if the child has no disability, people who are disabled are a part of life. Don't let them grow up to be an adult before they realize, oh, we had a president who was in a wheelchair. Oh, such and such was a disabled person. This historical character that I really admired. Let them know that young. Let them see that their heroes are able and disabled, and every type of race and every type of gender and so forth.
Yeah, great advice from all three of you about how to have better conversations and some resources to educate us on these things when we're talking to our kids. I want to stay with you, Morinike, if I could. You commented earlier about, do you out your neurodivergency or not? And there was a question in the chat on this topic. And so I'd like to bring it back to you if I could. And here's the question. I have ADHD, but I'm terrified of disclosing it to employers. I'm an attorney. Communication skills are key. I've tried developing tools to hide my disability, but I've lost jobs because of my inability to hide it effectively. I know I can do my job and do it well. It's just that my verbal skills are terrible, and I need more time to complete a written assessment. Can you advise me on what to do here? Any thoughts on that question?
A lot of thoughts, but I also would like my colleagues to be able to weigh in. So I would say that in this case, so I believe that, I believe in personal choice. So I live my life, I'm fairly public about being disabled, but that wasn't always the case because I'm still a Black woman in America. And that's not the wisest thing to do. I have a lot of things, unfortunately, working against me in this world. And so I didn't, so it wasn't that I had a problem, but I had to think practically about my life and what was the best thing to do, knowing that there's the law and then there's what people actually do. So for a long time, I found ways to accommodate myself, and I didn't, necessarily mention it. Now I'm in a different place in life, but I would say if everyone's situation is different. If I was in this situation, I would encourage this person strongly disclose, because what you're creating is a worse situation for yourself. So now you look like a non-disabled person who's just can't do their job, keeps getting fired, is irresponsible, is unproductive. Like, people are seeing your neurodivergence. They just don't know it's neurodivergence. They're seeing it as something else: laziness, lack of ability. And you having ADHD as someone who has it too, although it has challenges, there's also a lot of skills. I bet you can hyper focus like nobody's business. I bet when you get on something and you research and you go for it, I bet you can find patterns that none of your colleagues who don't have ADHD can find. So, and you can just go like Energizer Bunny when you do go. So you've got some terrible things going on and you've got some great things going on. But I think that every employer is not, yes, we live in an ableist society, but people sometimes will meet you where you are. So if you're applying for a job or you're whatever, and you email human resources and you state, I need accommodations for this question, or you share the accommodations that you need. Sometimes if they know going in, or if they don't know going in, but you share it, I think people would be a lot more accommodating of, oh, it's not that this person is lazy, or this person just ignored me and didn't want to respond to my email. This is just, a different way of processing. It's quite different, than I think about the example of, long time ago, there was this boy when I was a kid, and he was saying that, he didn't like this one girl because every time he tried to flirt with her, she ignored him. And he was like, she could at least just say, I don't like you, but she doesn't even look my way. And it turned out the girl was hearing impaired. She never heard him. If he had went up and tapped her and, and then talked to her and engaged her, then you're talking to yourself, essentially. And so it was just about the perception of the matter. And so, you have a lot more protections if you utilize the, Americans with Disability Act or what have you. And while, again, it's a person's personal choice to do that, I feel like it has gotten to a point, where I think it's unwise at this point for this person to not disclose unless they are in a place where they can find some type of entrepreneurship. And even in that, you have to be regulated and disciplined and so forth. So I would suggest that I think that people would rather know that you have ADHD and you just have different wiring than just think that you were just a sorry employee.
Great advice. And we are almost out of time, guys. So Kamel, I'd like to bring the last question to you, and then we'll do a quick wrap up. But Kamel, here's my question. I want to talk about accessibility in transportation. Delta, I think, came out just recently and said, hey, we're trying to develop seats for wheelchairs on our airplanes. I know there are lots of other transportation accessibility issues. What's on the horizon there that will support people living with disabilities?
I think everything that we've been discussing today, all these different areas are there because people are awakening to the fact that people with disabilities are moving. People with disabilities are contributing to so many different conversations. And so they have a space in so many different tables that our environment is going to have to adapt and make space for us. And we will be ready. We'll be ready to contribute. But here in New York City, I'll talk a little bit about my domain, which I am so proud to say that the MTA, the largest transportation network in the United States, has made a commitment of $30 billion to redesign the New York City transit system and ensure that every station is accessible. That is huge. We are the oldest system probably in the world at 118 years old right now. And no one anywhere is making that level of financial commitment to redesigning a system and undo all the wrong that was done when it was first designed and created. And I am so proud of my colleagues and the disability community who's been fighting alongside me. They've been the wind to my sails to help us arrive at this point in time. And in addition to a lot of the physical assets that we'll be installing, ramps and elevators, we're really talking about what is accessibility at large, and we're redefining accessibility. We're bringing in all these different stakeholders who are missing from that conversation, and we're also leaning onto technology. I truly do believe that technology provides us with a bridge to really solve a lot of the gaps of inequality in our systems. And what I look forward to most, and what I'm trying to create here, is providing individuals the tools that they need to be successful, to move around their communities in their own time, and not be reliant on anyone else to get from where they are to where they want to go. And that involves educating my colleagues about the fact that people with disabilities aren't just going to a doctor's appointment. You know, we are going to work, we are going to school, and we're going to a bar at the end of the day, just like everybody else. And beyond that, we need to do better at hiring people with disabilities. So many of my colleagues, my friends, and people that I know in the disability community are so overeducated and remain underemployed because people need to admit the fact that a person with a disability can be a contributing member of society. But it starts with us not accepting a no and finding those spaces that are being created for us where we have representation, not only at the entry level, but the MTA hired their first chief accessibility officer in its existence. That means that any incoming employee, from an intern to an analyst, can see someone at the leadership table that represents them, their backgrounds, and their experiences. Now, I am a member of the disability community, but I'm also an immigrant and Black and gay and Dominican and Jewish. And I bring all these diversities to the table, and I celebrate each and every one of them because representation matters, visibility matters, and people need to know who you are, where you come from, and the fact that you are not here alone.
Great advice. Tiffany, I want to leave the last word with you. Big question. What else can we do to advance disability and inclusion?
I'm going to say two provocative things, but they might not be that provocative. So number one is, I know there were a lot of questions from people in our community who might not feel comfortable yet asking for what they need. They might feel like a burden. And what I say to those people is that by you asking for what you need, you're paving the way for all these other disabled people who have felt like it wasn't their place to take up space. So it might feel very lonely in the beginning, but I want you to know that you've got this community here, even if it's just us three, or there are other communities that you can join, disability communities that are here cheering you on. And then the other provocative thing I want to say is, I'm going to come back to Q's point and what we've been reiterating throughout this conversation, is that these unemployment numbers are really bad. If you have an opportunity to hire a disabled person, if it's a contract to permanent position, if it's an internship or an apprenticeship or a shadowing, please give us an opportunity for us to show you what we can do, because I think you would be more than impressed And if we're not good at our jobs, then that wasn't the right job for us. So I also just wanted to close by saying, like, I know I highlighted that I did really well in one of my jobs. I've also gotten fired in another job. Like Morena K said, like, we're not going to be good at everything. And my hope is that for every disabled person that's out there, we can figure out what the thing is that they're good at. And then that's the job that they're going to thrive in.
Thank you so much, Kamel, Morena K, and Tiffany. Words of wisdom that I think are going to advance this conversation. At this point, we need to hand it back. We'd love to talk another hour, but we need to hand it back to the Ellevate leaders, and we're handing it to Maricela Herrera, Ellevate CEO. Thanks, everybody.